Poor cleaning lady makes a request to the young billionaire. What he does is unbelievable. The sound of the key in the lock was the music Mary waited all day to hear. It marked the border between two worlds, the cold, silent mansion where she worked, and her small, cozy apartment where real life happened. Her shoulders ached under the weight of a full day of cleaning. Mr. John's house, her employer's home, was a monument to loneliness. Immense hallways, expensive furniture covered in sheets in unused rooms, and a silence so profound she could hear her own breathing. She spent her hours removing traces of a life that wasn't hers, feeling more like a shadow than a person. But all of that dissolved the moment she walked through her own door. The fatigue, the invisibility, the back pain. It was all replaced by the anticipation of Sophie's hug. "I'm home, my love," Mary announced, dropping her bag on the floor. The response that came was silence. A strange silence that didn't belong in that place. Normally, little feet would come running in her direction, and a 5-year-old blonde hurricane would greet her with a hug that could cure any exhaustion. Today, nothing. A pang of unease shot through Mary. She walked through the living room and found her daughter sitting on the rug, her back to the door. Sophie, her girl with bright blonde hair, was motionless. Her unicorn backpack was tossed to the side, her small shoulders slumped. Mary knelt beside her, her heart already a little tighter. "Sweetheart, did something happen at school?" Sophie turned around slowly. Her eyes, usually a vibrant blue and full of life, were clouded by a sadness that didn't suit her face. There was a fragility there that set off an alarm in Mary's head. "Are you okay, my angel? Did you fight with a friend?" The girl just shook her head no. She sniffled softly and nestled into her mother's lap, seeking refuge. Mary wrapped her in her arms, feeling the tense little body against hers. She decided not to press. She knew her daughter, when she was ready, she would talk. While she waited, 1,000 terrible possibilities raced through her mind. Had someone hurt her? Was she sick? "How about a strawberry yogurt?" Mary tried, with the sweetest voice she could manage. "And then you can tell me why the bravest girl I know has such a sad little face." Sophie pulled away slightly, her chin trembling. From inside her backpack, she took out a colorful paper invitation, crumpled by nervous little hands. Mary took it, smoothing out the folds. Cheerful letters announced the family day, scheduled for the following Friday. The puzzle came together in her mind, and the final piece was painful. "It's because of the party, isn't it?" Sophie nodded, and the first tear rolled down her cheek. Mary wiped it away with her thumb, feeling a pain that mirrored her daughter's. "I don't want to go, Mommy." Her voice was a choked whisper. "But why, honey? You love school parties. Remember the last one. You didn't even want to come home." The girl shook her head more vehemently, as if trying to banish the memory. The anguish on her small face was palpable. "This one is different. The teacher said we have to go with our mommy and daddy." Sophie took a deep breath, fighting back tears. "All the other kids are going with their mum and dad. And I don't have a dad." The sentence, gone spoken with the brutal simplicity of childhood innocence, hit Mary like a punch to the gut. Each word was a needle piercing the protective bubble she tried to build around her daughter. It was her greatest fear materializing. The absence of Sophie's father, a man who left before she was even born, leaving a hole that Mary tried to fill every day with double the love, with triple the effort. She felt her own heart contract. It was a physical sensation, a sharp pain in her chest that left her breathless for a second. She looked at her daughter's little face, at the blonde hair and light eyes so much like her own, and saw her own history of abandonment threatening to repeat itself. She, who had also grown up without parents, had sworn that Sophie would never feel that loneliness. And there she was, failing in her most important promise. "My love, look at me," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "You have me. I'm your mum and your dad. I'm worth 1,000. She forced a smile, which looked more like a grimace of pain. "But I wanted a real dad," Sophie insisted, with the irrefutable logic of a child. "Just for one day to go to the party. Amy said her dad is going to buy her cotton candy. Noah's dad always tosses him up really high. What about me? The kids will stare at me, Mommy. They'll ask again why I don't have a dad. Sophie's words echoed the silent questions Mary asked herself every night. Why? Why did life have to be so unfair to a little girl so small and full of light? The exhaustion from her work at John's mansion seemed to weigh on her with twice the force. The image of that enormous, cold and empty house contrasted violently with the warmth of her love and the intensity of her problem. John had so much space, so much money, but lived in a sepulchral silence. She had so little, but her world was filled with Sophie's love, a love that, in that moment, she felt powerless to protect from sadness. She felt helpless. She couldn't just create a father out of thin air. She couldn't erase the reality that it was just the two of them against the world. But when Sophie buried her face in her shoulder, sobbing softly, Mary's helplessness began to transform into something else. An ember of fury and determination ignited in her chest. It was the primal force of a mother willing to move mountains to prevent a single extra tear from falling from her daughter's eyes. The world could be unfair, but she would not accept defeat. That school party, such a mundane event for others, became her battlefield. She didn't have a plan. She had no idea what she would do. The solution seemed impossible, a mirage in the desert of her options. But Sophie's pain was real, and that was all that mattered. Mary hugged her daughter tightly, inhaling the childhood scent from her hair. She rocked her gently, feeling the sobs diminish until they became just tired sighs. "Don't cry anymore, my angel," she whispered against Sophie's ear. "Mommy will figure something out, I promise." The little girl, exhausted from crying, drifted off to sleep in her arms. Mary stayed there on the floor of her small apartment, with her entire world in her lap. The promise floated in the air, solid and heavy. She didn't know how, but she would keep it. She would find a solution. She had to. The promise made to Sophie the night before was a burning ember in Mary's chest. Throughout her workday at John's mansion, she felt the heat of that promise mixed with the cold chill of fear. The idea born of desperation now seemed like complete madness. Asking her employer, a man encapsulated in a world of wealth and distance, to play the role of her daughter's father was a plan with a higher chance of ending in disaster than in success. As she dusted a bookshelf in the library, her hands trembled slightly. With every leather-bound book she touched, she imagined the conversation. The words formed and dissolved in her mind. "Mr. John, could you do me a favor?" No, too vague. "Mr. John, I need your help with something personal." Even worse, he'd cut her off before she finished. She rehearsed the sentence in dozens of ways, but they all sounded ridiculous, bordering on delusional. The mansion, with its imposing silence, seemed to amplify her insecurities. It was a place where emotions seemed to have no space. Everything was order, polish, and perfection. John, on the rare occasions she saw him, moved through those corridors like a king in his empty castle. His gaze always focused on something distant, on business happening miles away. She was just the staff, a discreet presence in charge of maintaining the order of his private sanctuary. Asking him to step into her chaotic and imperfect world was like asking the sun to become the moon. She felt torn. One part of her, the rational part, screamed for her to forget this suicidal idea. Losing this job would mean eviction, hunger. It would mean failing Sophie in the most basic and concrete way possible. But the other part, the mother part, couldn't erase the memory of her daughter's tear-filled eyes. That look was her compass, and it pointed directly toward this act of insane courage. The turning point came late in the afternoon, while she was cleaning John's office. It was the last task of the day. As she emptied a small wastebasket, her elbow bumped a picture frame that was facing the wall. It fell onto the carpet with a dull thud. Her heart racing, she picked it up to put it back, but the image caught her attention. The photo showed a boy of about 6, in a suit, next to a tall man with a severe expression. The boy was clearly a young John. But what held Mary's gaze wasn't the resemblance, but the absence of joy. Little John wasn't smiling. He was looking at the camera with an adult seriousness, a loneliness in his eyes that Mary recognized instantly. It was the look of a child who had learned far too early not to expect anything. In that moment, John ceased to be just the rich, unattainable boss. He became, for a brief instant, that lonely boy in the photograph. An unexpected wave of empathy washed over Mary, and with it, a new determination. Maybe, just maybe, this man understood what a child's loneliness felt like. That glimpse into his past was the push she needed. She finished her work, put away the buckets and cloths in the closet, each movement now imbued with a clear purpose. Her hands no longer trembled. Her heart, however, was pounding uncontrollably, a drum announcing the battle to come. She walked down the long marble hallway, the sound of her steps echoing in the silence. Each step was a victory against the fear that tried to paralyze her. She stopped in front of the office door, which was ajar. John was there, just as before, the light from his laptop illuminating his focused face. He didn't notice her presence. She took a deep breath, the air feeling heavy in her lungs, and knocked. He didn't look up. "Finished for the day, Mary." His voice, neutral and professional, was like a bucket of cold water, but she didn't back down. "Mr. John?" Her voice came out firm, surprising even herself. He finally raised his head, the impatience clear on his face for being interrupted. "Yes?" "What is it?" Mary entered the office, stopping at a respectful distance from the massive desk that separated them. She felt her face burn, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I know what I'm about to ask is completely out of line, and that you're under no obligation, but I have no one else to turn to." The words came out in a single breath. John arched an eyebrow, his curiosity overcoming his irritation. He leaned back in his chair, a silent invitation for her to continue. She swallowed hard. It was time. "Mr. John, I know this is asking a lot, but could you pretend to be my husband for just one day?" The silence that fell in the room was so thick it seemed palpable. John's expression was one of pure disbelief. He looked at her as if she had started speaking another language. He blinked once, twice, his brain processing the information that didn't fit into any category of his organized life. Panic threatened to overwhelm Mary, and she hurried to explain, her voice thick with desperate urgency. "It's not for me, it's for my daughter. She's 5 years old, there's a family day at her school, and she's heartbroken because she's the only child who won't have a father to bring. She cried all night. I just need someone, for a few hours, so she doesn't feel different from the other children." She stopped, having laid her soul and her greatest weakness bare before this man, who was practically a stranger. John remained silent, but his gaze had changed. The initial shock gave way to an indecipherable expression. He didn't seem angry or dismissive. He seemed lost. The phrase, "the only child who won't have a father to bring," struck a deep place within him, a place he had kept locked for decades. The image of the boy in the photograph returned to his mind, not as a memory but as a feeling. The feeling of standing at the window, waiting for a car that never arrived. The silent humiliation at school events. He looked at the woman before him. For the first time, he didn't see the cleaning lady, but a mother willing to humiliate herself for her child's sake. The audacity of the request was staggering, but the vulnerability behind it was even more so. Saying a no would be the logical thing to do. But, for the first time in a long time, logic seemed inadequate. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of turmoil, and looked away toward the window. After an eternity that lasted perhaps 30 seconds, he faced her again. "When is this party?" His voice was low, devoid of its usual formality. Mary felt a spark of hope. "This Friday, at 6 in the evening." He looked at his monitor, at his schedule packed with commitments. Then, with a click, he moved a meeting. "All right," he said finally. The words sounded strange in that room. "I'll do it." Mary stood frozen, unable to process his answer. She had expected a refusal, maybe even to be fired. The acceptance left her speechless. John seemed to notice her state of shock and continued, already taking control of the situation. "On Friday, then, come here and we'll go together. It's easier." On Friday, the air in Mary's small apartment vibrated with a mix of anxiety and excitement. Sophie wore her prettiest dress, a light blue one that matched her eyes. and she couldn't stop jumping in front of the mirror, adjusting the ribbon in her blonde hair. Mary, meanwhile, felt her heart beating erratically. She had chosen a simple but elegant outfit and looked at herself in the mirror with a nervousness she hadn't felt in years. That night felt like a fever dream, and she was afraid she might wake up at any moment. Arriving at John's mansion was like entering another dimension. He was waiting for them at the door. To Mary's surprise, he wasn't wearing his usual formal suit. He had on chinos and a button-down shirt, with the sleeves slightly rolled up. He looked younger, more approachable. The most shocking thing, however, was the small smile he gave when he saw Sophie. "Wow, you look very pretty," he said, his voice sounding a little rusty at giving a compliment. Sophie, who had been hiding behind Mary's legs, broke into a radiant smile. "You don't look like a boss today either," she said, with the disarming honesty of a child. Mary held her breath, but John let out a short, genuine laugh. "I'll take that as a compliment. Shall we? We don't want to be late." His car was as luxurious and silent on the inside as his house. The smell of new leather filled the air. Sophie sat in the back seat, looking out the window with wide eyes, while Mary felt terribly out of place in the passenger seat. The initial silence was heavy, filled only by the soft hum of the engine. Mary didn't know what to say. John was a complete stranger, and they were about to pretend they were a family. It was Sophie who broke the ice. "I've never been in a fancy car like this," she exclaimed, kicking her little feet in the air. John looked in the rearview mirror, and his face softened. "I'm glad you like it. Excited for the party." "Very," Sophie replied. "We get to do a sack race. Have you ever been to a school party, John?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Mary looked at him, expecting a short answer, maybe a simple yes. But John's expression changed. A veil of melancholy passed over his eyes, and he looked at the road ahead as if he were seeing a scene from long ago. "When I was a kid, my father never went to my school events." His voice was low, almost a murmur, and not directed at anyone in particular. "He always said work was more important. I would wait, but he never showed up." The confession was so unexpected, so raw, that Mary felt a lump form in her throat. In that instant, the wall separating Mr. John, the rich boss, from John, the man, completely crumbled. She saw beyond the wealth and formality, seeing the lonely child he once was. She felt a wave of compassion so strong she had to look away, touched by the vulnerability he had unintentionally let slip. When they arrived at the school, the playground was already crowded with running children, music, and the smell of popcorn. The atmosphere was vibrant and chaotic. For John, accustomed to silence and order, it was a sensory shock. But before he could retreat into his shell, Sophie grabbed his hand tightly. "Come on, I want to introduce you to Sarah and Amy," she said, pulling him into the middle of the crowd. From that moment on, Sophie didn't let him go. She was beaming. With a pride Mary had never seen, she introduced him to everyone. "This is my mom, Mary, and this is my dad, John." The word dad sounded so natural coming from her that it both hurt and healed Mary's heart at the same time. And John, he simply followed her lead. At first he was stiff, an awkward giant in a world of little people. But Sophie, with her contagious energy, gave him no choice. She pulled him into the line for the fishing game, and he, the man who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, found himself concentrating on hooking a plastic fish for a cheap prize. And when he succeeded, Sophie's shout of joy made something shift inside him. She led him to the sack race, and after much insistence, he got into a burlap sack and started hopping awkwardly, losing to a more in-shape father, but laughing. It was a rusty laugh at first, like an engine that hadn't run in a long time, but it gradually became looser, more real. He helped her with the ring toss, bought her a pink cotton candy, and even allowed a little girl to paint a clumsy blue star on his hand. Mary watched from a distance, her heart overflowing with an emotion she couldn't name. Seeing her daughter so happy, so complete, was the greatest joy of her life. But seeing that man, always so serious and closed off, opening up and allowing himself to feel the simple joy of a school party that touched her in a deep and unexpected way, he wasn't just pretending. On some level, he was living it. There was a moment during a magic show when Sophie sat between them, resting her head on John's shoulder and holding Mary's hand. Looking at the colored lights, with the sound of children's laughter all around, they looked, for an instant, like a real family. John looked down at the little blonde head resting on his shoulder and felt a wave of warmth he hadn't experienced in years. It was a sense of belonging, of genuine connection, something none of his business successes had ever given him. It was the healing of a wound he didn't even know was still open. When the party ended, Sophie was exhausted, but her eyes were shining with happiness. On the way back, she fell asleep in the back seat, a serene smile on her face. The silence in the car, this time, wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, filled with the experience they had shared. When they stopped in front of Mary's building, she turned to him. "I don't even know what to say," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "You did so much for my daughter today, more than you can imagine. I don't know how to thank you." John looked at her, and for a second Mary saw in his eyes the reflection of everything that had happened that night. The laughter, the vulnerability, the connection, but he quickly put his mask of self-control back on. "There's no need to thank me, Mary. It was fine." But it wasn't fine. It was transformative. He felt it in every fiber of his being. As he watched them get out of the car and enter the building, John sat there for a long time. He looked at the blue star painted on his hand and felt a tightness in his chest. Not of pain, but of something new, something he didn't yet understand. He kept to himself how much that night had also moved him, how much a little girl's laughter and the gratitude in a mother's eyes had made him feel more alive than in all his years of solitary success. The normality that followed the school party was a thin layer of ice over a river of turbulent emotions. For Mary, returning to clean the mansion on Monday was a surreal experience. The place was the same, but her perception of it had been permanently altered. The silent rooms no longer seemed just empty, but rather waiting for something. Her boss, the distant and formal Mr. John, was now simply John in her mind, the man who laughed awkwardly in a sack race and who carried his own history of loneliness. This new reality made her nervous, unsure of how to act, of where the boundaries now lay after they had been so dramatically crossed. The most palpable change, however, came from John. He seemed to have abandoned his frantic work pace that kept him away from home. Mary found him with surprising frequency, working in his office with the door open, no longer closed like a fortress. Sometimes she would see him in the living room, a book in his lap, but with a distant look as if he were reflecting on something profound. He no longer passed her with a hurried nod. Now he stopped. Their gazes would meet for a second longer than necessary, and he watched her. At first, this observation made her tense. She cleaned with a self-conscious rigidity, afraid he was looking for flaws, perhaps regretting the forced intimacy of the party. But slowly, she realized there was no judgment in his gaze. There was a genuine, almost investigative curiosity. He watched her sweep the floor, and his expression was that of a man trying to solve a puzzle. And, in a way, to John, she was a puzzle. The party had shaken him. The pure and simple joy he felt, the sense of belonging beside those two had created a fissure in his perfectly ordered life. Sitting in his office, he found himself unable to concentrate on market reports. His mind kept returning to the sound of Sophie's laughter, to the silent gratitude in Mary's eyes, to the blue star painted on his hand. He, who commanded meetings and made million-dollar decisions, felt like a complete novice in the territory of genuine human emotions. His housekeeper, the woman he had barely noticed, was the personification of a strength he didn't understand. He saw her now with new eyes. He saw the dignity in her movements, the way she faced dirt and disorder, and with patience and hard work, created cleanliness and harmony. It was a powerful metaphor for her own life. He contrasted her silent dedication with the loud and often empty conversations of his own world, and he felt a growing admiration. The first conversation happened on Tuesday. He found her in the kitchen, polishing the stainless steel faucet until it shone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching, before clearing his throat to announce his presence. "Mary." "Good morning," she turned as her heart skipping a beat. "Good morning, Mr. John." Please, call me John, he said, the phrase sounding a bit too formal for the request it contained. I wanted to ask, how is Sophie? The simple question caught her by surprise. She's well, thank you, excited about school. Did she mention anything else about the party? There was a hesitation in his voice, a vulnerability that disarmed her. Mary allowed a small smile to appear. She talks about it every day. She's made several drawings. In all of them, you're a superhero. A glint of genuine pleasure lit up John's eyes. A superhero. I think that title is a bit of an exaggeration. For a 5-year-old who had the best day of her life, it seems quite fitting, Mary replied, her voice soft. The conversation was brief, but it opened a door. Small interactions began to dot the days. He would ask about her day. He'd comment on the weather. One day, he saw her looking at a rose bush in the garden and remarked, "Those are my favorites." She replied, "My mother used to have a small garden. She said that growing something is like taking care of hope." It was the first time she had offered a piece of herself without him asking. Mary, for her part, fought against her own distrust. Years of a hard life had taught her to be cautious, especially with men in positions of power. But John's kindness seemed devoid of ulterior motives. His interest was quiet, respectful, and she couldn't deny that a part of her felt warmed by that attention, by being seen as a person and not just as a pair of cleaning hands. The turning point came in the form of a 5-year-old blonde hurricane. A doctor's appointment for Sophie was cancelled at the last minute, and Mary had no choice but to bring her to the mansion for the last 2 hours of her shift. She set her up in a quiet corner with her colored pencils and a stern warning not to make noise and not to touch anything. The warning lasted exactly 10 minutes. As soon as Sophie heard John's voice in the hallway, she shot off like an arrow, ignoring Mary's panicked whispers. "John, you're here." John, who was on the phone, stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the small figure running towards him, and to Mary's astonishment, his expression transformed from surprise to pure affection. He ended the call abruptly. "Sophie, what a nice surprise." "I made a castle," she said, holding out her notebook. "And you're the king who lives in it. Mommy is the queen, and I'm the princess. We have a pet dragon." John crouched down, getting on her level. Mary watched from a distance, her heart in her throat. The naturalness with which he knelt, the care with which he took the notebook, everything in her screamed that this scene shouldn't be real. "A pet dragon. That sounds very dangerous," he said, his tone serious but with a playful glint in his eyes. "No, he's nice. He breathes soap bubbles instead of fire." John's laughter echoed through the hallway. A genuine laugh, without the weight of formality. He talked with Sophie for several minutes about the dragon and the castle, asking questions and listening to her answers with an attention he normally reserved for his business partners. Mary stood frozen, watching the scene. The ease with which Sophie included him in her fantasy world, and the willingness with which he entered it, was something magical and terrifying. Magical because it was beautiful to see, terrifying because it created a bond, a hope she didn't feel she had the right to have. Later, after Sophie was thoroughly charmed and had returned to her drawings, John found Mary in the living room. She was cleaning the huge glass windows that overlooked the garden, her reflection mixing with the trees outside. He approached in silence, noticing she seemed distant, lost in thought. "She's an incredible girl," he said, his voice low. Mary turned, a melancholic smile on her face. "Yes, she is. She's my light. You dream of big things for her, don't you?" The question was personal, but after seeing him interact with Sophie, it felt natural. Mary stopped what she was doing, the cleaning cloth forgotten in her hand. She looked out at the garden, at the vast green expanse that seemed to represent all the opportunities she never had. "I dream of everything," she confessed. "I dream of the simplest things, that she never has to worry if there's food on the table, that she has a warm room in the winter. And I dream of the big things too, that she can study, go to college. That she has choices." He moved a little closer, his gaze fixed on her profile. "And you, Mary? What are your choices? What do you dream of for yourself?" The question hit her hard. No one had ever asked her that. Her life had always been about surviving, about taking care of Sophie. Her own dreams were a luxury she had buried long ago. She turned to him, and the final barrier of her reserve crumbled. She felt he wasn't just being curious, he genuinely wanted to know. "I don't let myself dream for myself, John," she said, her voice firm but laden with a lifetime of resignation. "My dreams died a long time ago. I lost my parents when I was very young. I barely remember them. I went to live with relatives, and for as long as I can remember, I've worked. Cleaning, serving, doing whatever was needed. There was never time or money for school. I never had the chance to be a teenager, to discover talents, to think about a future that wasn't the next rent payment. Life was hard on me, but I endured. I learned not to wait for fairy tales." She lifted her chin and her clear eyes met his, without fear and without shame. "When Sophie was born, everything changed. Suddenly, I had a reason not just to survive, but to fight. Every cent I earn, every extra hour I work, it's for her. It's for her college fund. It's so she can have the dance classes I never had, the books I never read. My dream, John, is to sit at her graduation one day and know that all my struggles were worth it. It's to give her the one thing I never had, a chance." She finished, her voice choked with restrained emotion. The silence that followed in the room was deep, reverent. John looked at her, completely captivated. Her story was not a lament, but a declaration of strength, a testament to resilience. He, who had everything, felt humbled before this woman who, having nothing, was determined to give the world to her daughter. He said nothing. There were no words that could do justice to that moment. He just looked at her with an admiration so overwhelming it was almost palpable. In that instant, she ceased to be his housekeeper, Sophie's mother, or a charity case. She became Mary, a woman of extraordinary strength whose story of sacrifice and unconditional love was the most real and impressive thing he had ever encountered. And he knew with a frightening certainty that he no longer wanted to just watch her from a distance. John's proposal for Mary to bring Sophie to the mansion after school was a turning point. Initially, Mary felt an overwhelming panic at the idea. Her life with Sophie was her sanctuary, a world apart from the formality and wealth she cleaned every day. Bringing her daughter into that environment felt like a violation, a dangerous mixing of her two worlds. She feared the mess, the noise, the risk of Sophie breaking something priceless. Above all, she feared the dependency, the feeling of accepting more than just a simple kindness. But John's logic was undeniable. Sophie's afternoons would be safer and more comfortable there than with the elderly neighbor, and Mary would gain a peace of mind that was priceless. With a heart torn between fear and immense gratitude, she accepted. Sophie's arrival at the mansion was not a small wave. It was a tsunami of life that shook the silent foundations of the house. For the first few days, she moved with a timid caution, marveling at the space, the high ceilings, and the seemingly endless hallways. But a 5-year-old's shyness is fleeting. Soon, John's house became her kingdom. The silence, once so thick that John could hear a clock ticking 2 rooms away, was the first to yield. It was replaced by a soundtrack the house had never known, the sound of little feet running on the cold marble, the dull thud of a rubber ball, sharp laughter that echoed and seemed to clean the cobwebs of loneliness, and the off-key singing of children's songs that became the afternoon's background music. Next came the explosion of color. The stainless steel refrigerator, once an immaculate surface, became the main exhibition space for the Sophie Art Gallery. Vibrant drawings, made with the creative freedom that only children possess, were held up with fruit magnets that John, on a whim, had bought specifically for this purpose. There were portraits of the family, where he was always drawn smiling, much taller than the other figures. There were unicorns, rainbows, and suns with sunglasses. John would find himself standing in front of the refrigerator, not to get something to eat, but to study the new additions, a discreet smile forming on his lips. The impeccable order of his house was gently subverted. Sofa cushions were transformed into forts. A row of chairs in the dining room became a train. John would find dolls sitting in his meeting chairs in the office, and, instead of getting annoyed, he would carefully walk around them. His house, Once a sterile space that served more to impress visitors than to be lived in, was finally being used. It was accumulating the marks of life, the small, sweet imperfections that turned four walls into a home. And he realized he liked it more than all the silent perfection that had surrounded him before. Sophie, in turn, adopted John as a central figure in her universe. Without understanding the complex social barriers of adults, she treated him with a mixture of respect and familiarity. She would invade his office not to ask for something, but to announce, "John, it's tea break time." And then she would appear with a toy tray with empty cups, expecting him to stop his work for an imaginary tea party, and he would stop. He would hang up the phone, close his laptop, and participate in the ritual with a playful seriousness, to the astonishment and emotion of Mary, who watched them from afar. The connection between them deepened with each day, but the moment that definitively sealed this new reality happened on an autumn afternoon, with the rain gently tapping against the windows. The dining room table, an imposing dark wood piece of furniture that rarely saw more than one plate, had become Sophie's study center. Mary was by her side, trying to help her with her homework. It was a math worksheet, with problems involving adding two-digit numbers. Mary looked at the problem, 15 plus 7, and felt a wave of panic. In her head, the numbers danced and refused to make sense. Her fragmented education had not prepared her for this. She tried to count on her fingers but got lost. The simple logic of the operation eluded her, and a sense of shame washed over her. It was a deep, silent humiliation, the awareness of her own limitations exposed by her daughter's need. "Mommy, how do you do it?" Sophie asked, the childish impatience in her voice. Mary felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to be her daughter's hero, the person with all the answers, but there she was, defeated by a first-grade math problem. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to be honest. "I'm sorry, honey. Mommy doesn't know how to solve this." The words came out with the weight of lead, a testament to her failure. Sophie pouted, disappointed. At that exact moment, John entered the dining room from his office. He immediately sensed the tense atmosphere, the open notebook, Sophie's frustrated look, and the poorly disguised anguish on Mary's face. "So is everything all right in here?" he asked softly. Mary felt her face flush. "Everything's fine, it's just math isn't my strong suit." John approached and looked at the notebook over Sophie's shoulder. He pulled up a chair and sat down next to her, completely ignoring the formality of the situation. "Shout, you know, numbers can be a bit stubborn sometimes," he said to Sophie in a conspiratorial tone. "But we're more stubborn than they are. What's the problem?" Sophie pointed to the sum. John didn't give her the answer. Instead, he turned the exercise into a game. "Okay, you have 15 colored pencils, right?" he began. Sophie nodded. "Now I give you 7 more pencils. That's a whole bunch of pencils. How do we figure out how many there are in total? Let's do it in parts. You have 15. If I give you 5 of my 7 pencils, how many do you have?" 20, said Sophie, who knew how to count by fives. "Perfect," John praised. "Now, I still have 2 pencils to give you." 20 plus 2. Sophie's eyes lit up. 22. "Exactly," said John, smiling. 22 pencils. You're a math genius." He spent the rest of the afternoon there, sitting at the table with them, explaining each problem with patience, using everyday examples, turning homework into an adventure. Mary watched in silence. She stepped back a little, becoming a spectator to this domestic scene that seemed to come from a dream. She saw the light of understanding in her daughter's eyes, saw the admiration with which Sophie looked at John, and she saw the expression on his face, an expression of genuine contentment, of purpose, that she had never seen when he talked about his business. When Sophie finished the last problem and celebrated with a shout of victory, she threw herself into John's arms in a spontaneous hug. "Wow, John, you're so cool, the best teacher in the world." He seemed surprised for a moment, then returned the hug, a large unprotective hand on her small back. In that instant, something clicked in Mary's heart. The tears she had been holding back finally escaped, silent. They weren't tears of sadness or shame, but of an emotion so overwhelming it had no name. For the first time, she didn't see John as her boss, as a benefactor, or as the man from the party. She saw him as a part of her daughter's life, a good, solid, and real part. He was there, filling a space she desperately wanted to fill but couldn't, and he wasn't doing it out of pity or obligation. He was there because he wanted to be, and that realization was, at the same time, the most wonderful and the most frightening thing that had ever happened to her. Happiness, Mary knew from experience, was a warm sun that could be suddenly covered by dark clouds. The harmony that had settled in the mansion, turning it into a haven of laughter and learning, was shattered abruptly and frighteningly. It happened on a Thursday. Sophie, who had been running and playing with her usual energy the afternoon before, woke up different. She was listless, her cheeks flushed with a fever that Mary's eyes detected from a distance. "Mommy, my throat hurts," she whimpered, her voice hoarse, snuggling under the covers. Mary's heart sank. Sophie's body was hot to the touch, and her breathing seemed a bit labored. The initial diagnosis of a common cold, which Mary tried to maintain with hot tea and lots of affection, soon proved to be overly optimistic. Throughout the day, Sophie's fever climbed dangerously, and a dry, persistent cough began to rack her small body, leaving her exhausted and tearful. By late afternoon, Mary's panic began to take hold. Sophie's breathing became a worried wheeze, and her lips started to take on a bluish tint. That's when John arrived home from a rare off-site meeting. He found Mary in the living room, trying in vain to get Sophie to drink some water, the mother's face etched with a fear he had never seen before. "What happened?" he asked, his voice laden with immediate urgency, dropping his briefcase on the floor. "I don't know." Mary's voice was trembling, on the verge of tears. "She's only getting worse. The fever won't break, and she can barely breathe." John didn't hesitate for a second. He knelt beside Sophie, touched her forehead, and saw the difficulty with which air entered her lungs. His expression became a mask of seriousness and determination. "We're going to the hospital, now." Mary was frozen, her mind clouded by panic, but John took control. With surprising gentleness, he picked up Sophie, who was limp and feverish, and wrapped her in a blanket. "Get your purse on, Mary. I'll drive you." The drive to the hospital was a blur of imaginary sirens in Mary's head. She sat in the back seat, holding Sophie's hot little hand, while John drove with a speed and concentration that were both frightening and reassuring. He was no longer her boss, nor her daughter's friend. He was a rock, a center of calm in the storm of fear that was consuming her. At the hospital, the bureaucracy and the wait felt like torture, but John was there, handling everything with a quiet authority, dealing with forms and nurses, while Mary refused to leave Sophie's side. Soon the girl was taken in, and the diagnosis came quickly and with a frightening weight. Severe pneumonia. She would need to be admitted immediately. The news hit Mary like a physical blow. The world seemed to spin. Hospital, tubes, oxygen. The fear of losing the only person who mattered in her life was paralyzing. She leaned against the cold hallway wall, her legs weak, feeling small and helpless. That's when she felt a firm hand on her shoulder. "She's going to be okay, Mary," John said, his voice low but full of a certainty she desperately needed to hear. "The doctors here are excellent. She's in the best possible place." In the days that followed, John proved that his words were not just empty comfort. He became Mary's anchor. While she refused to leave the hospital bed, he took care of everything else. He called her work, explaining the situation and ensuring her job would be safe. He brought Mary hot meals, insisting that she eat, and showed up with coffee at the most unexpected times. He handled the logistics, spoke with the doctors to understand the technical details of the treatment, and then translated them for Mary in simple, reassuring language. But the most important thing was his presence. He spent hours in the hospital room, sitting in an uncomfortable chair, reading stories to Sophie when she was awake, or simply sitting in silence beside Mary when the girl slept, the only sound being the constant beeping of the monitors. The first night was the worst. Sophie, scared and in pain, cried a lot, and John stayed by the bed, holding her other hand, the one Mary wasn't holding. He whispered calming words, telling impromptu stories about dragons that breathed soap bubbles until exhaustion finally overcame her. He didn't leave. He spent the entire night in that armchair, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his gaze never wavering from the small figure in the bed. Mary watched him, stunned. His dedication was something she couldn't process. He had a company to run, deals to close, a whole life that was being put on hold because of them. He had no obligation. Yet there he was, sharing the vigil, sharing the weight of her fear as if it were his own. On the third night, Sophie was finally sleeping more peacefully. The fever had started to break, and her breathing was no longer so difficult. The crisis seemed to have passed. The relief in the small hospital room was palpable. Mary was sitting by the bed, exhausted, but with a slightly lighter heart. John was in the armchair, looking out the window at the city lights below. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence of complicity, forged in shared anxiety and hope. Mary looked at him, at the man who in just a few days had become her fortress. "You're different from any boss I've ever had," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper so as not to wake Sophie. The sentence was a massive understatement. Her former bosses barely knew her name, treated her like a shadow. John was here, sharing one of the most terrifying moments of her life with her. He turned to her, and in the dim light of the room his eyes seemed deeper, more serious than ever. He stood up and approached the bed. In a gesture that seemed both bold and completely natural, he took her hand, the one that wasn't touching Sophie. The warmth of his skin was a solid, real comfort. "Don't see me as your boss, Mary." His voice was intense, filled with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "Please, that, at my house, is just a job. What happened here these last few days, what happened at the school party, that's something else." He glanced at Sophie's serene face and then turned his eyes back to Mary's, holding her gaze with his. "I want to be part of your lives in a different way." The words hung in the air, redefining everything. It wasn't an act of charity, it wasn't pity. It was a choice, a declaration. He was asking to come in, to become part of their small, fierce family. And, holding that man's hand, with her daughter sleeping safely beside her, Mary felt, for the first time in a very, very long time, that maybe she didn't have to fight alone anymore. The hospital door closing behind them was like the final period on a dark chapter, and the beginning of a blank page filled with a promising light. Sophie, nestled safely in her car seat in the back of John's car, had already relegated the illness to a distant memory, a story she would tell with dramatic flair about needles and weird food. For her, the world was once again a place of games and discoveries. For the two adults in the front seat, however, the silence in the car was thick, laden with everything that had happened, and, more importantly, with everything that had been said in the dimness of that hospital room. John's words, "I want to be part of your lives in a different way," were a melody that played incessantly in Mary's mind. She analyzed them from every angle, searching for hidden meanings, afraid to let herself feel the hope they promised. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion was one of palpable delicacy. John insisted that Mary take the week off to care for Sophie, but he himself did not stay away. He appeared daily, bringing not just groceries or toys for Sophie, but also his calm and constant presence. They moved in a new orbit. He watched her care for Sophie with an admiration that was almost reverence. She watched him interact with her daughter with a tenderness that completely belied the image of the ruthless businessman. They built an impromptu domestic routine during that period of convalescence, sharing the preparation of simple meals, watching movies wrapped in blankets in the living room, discussing the dosage of Sophie's medicine. In each of these mundane acts, the bond between them strengthened, becoming something solid, real, and undeniable. They were no longer employer and employee, they were partners in a crisis, and that partnership refused to retreat now that the crisis had passed. A week later, with Sophie fully recovered and the house once again filled with her vibrant energy, John felt that the time for ambiguity was over. The change that had occurred within him was profound and irreversible, and he needed the external reality to reflect this new internal truth. He waited until the end of what would have been Mary's first day back to her old routine. He found her in the spacious laundry room, folding the last of the cleaning cloths with an automatic efficiency, a ritual that marked the transition of their roles. He leaned against the doorframe, simply watching her for a moment. He saw the strength in her back, the grace in her movements. He saw the woman who had faced the world alone and who, even now, hesitated to accept help. "Mary," his calm voice made her stop. She turned, her clear eyes meeting his with a mixture of expectation and caution. "Can we talk for a moment?" he asked, though it sounded more like an invitation. She nodded, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. He entered the room and came closer, his presence filling the space. "What we went through at the hospital," he began, getting straight to the point, but with a gentle voice, "was a turning point. It changed everything for me. I spent my whole life chasing an idea of success that I was taught. More money, more power, more growth. I built a wall of achievements around myself, and only in those nights, sitting in that uncomfortable armchair looking at you and Sophie, did I realize I was living inside an empty fortress." His gaze was intense, stripped of any artifice. "You two, with your courage and your love, showed me what a real home is. You've given me more meaning in a few months than I've found in 40 years of my life, and I cannot, in good conscience, continue to maintain the farce that you are just someone who works for me. This relationship, for me, has not been professional for a long time." Mary felt the air leave her lungs. Every word he spoke was a brick, being carefully removed from the wall she kept around herself. "Mary, I don't want you to continue as my employee anymore." The sentence was said with a clarity and finality that left no room for doubt. "I don't see you that way. I see you as my partner, my equal, and that's what I want. I want you to walk by my side." The proposal was so monumental, so transformative that Mary couldn't form a response. Walk by his side. The phrase echoed in her mind, dazzling and terrifying. It was the offer of a world she had never allowed herself to dream existed for her. Tears welled up in her eyes, not of sadness, but of the shock of having a dream she didn't even know she had come true. "John, You don't have to give me an answer now," he said, noticing the turmoil of emotions on her face. "I know it's a lot to process, but I want you to know that the offer isn't an impulse. It's the most right thing I've ever felt in my life. I want you to stop working. I want you to study, to discover your talents, to tend to your garden. I want you to live without the weight of survival on your shoulders, and I want to have the honor of providing that for you." As Mary absorbed the weight of that conversation, John's transformation was already causing shockwaves in his professional environment. The titan of industry, known for his almost inhuman work ethic, had become an anomaly. In board meetings, his mental absence was notorious. In the middle of a heated discussion about market projections, his partners would see him crack a discreet smile. They thought he'd had a strategic epiphany, but in reality, he was remembering Sophie's imitation of a penguin the night before. His mind, once a computer focused on data and profits, was now invaded by colorful and warm memories that made the gray of the corporate world almost unbearable. He began to redefine boundaries. The no meetings after 5 rule became legendary in the office. Once, an important client insisted on a call at 5:30. John's response, through his assistant, was polite but firm. "Mr. Harrison has an unmissable appointment to build a pillow fort. He can return your call tomorrow at 9. There was a shocked silence on the other end of the line, followed by an incredulous laugh. The news spread, and John earned a new reputation, that of a man who had somehow cracked the code to life. His daily departure from the office became a ritual. At exactly 4:45 dice, he would begin to pack his briefcase, not with the haste of someone fleeing, but with the anticipation of someone going to meet something wonderful. "See you tomorrow, John," one of his executives asked one day, seeing him leave. "Absolutely," John replied, already on his way to the elevator. "Family dinner is at 6. It's my most important deadline of the day." This change in perspective didn't make him a less effective businessman. On the contrary, his new empathy, learned from caring for Mary and Sophie, made him a more human leader. He began to see his employees not as resources, but as people. with their own families, fears, and dreams. He implemented more flexible work policies, increased parental leave, and made a point of getting to know the people who worked for him. His company, once known for its relentless competitiveness, began to be known for its culture of well-being. Productivity, to everyone's surprise except John's, increased. He finally understood that a man's true legacy is not what he builds in concrete and steel, but what he cultivates in the hearts of the people he loves. He had spent his entire life striving for the top of the mountain, only to discover that true happiness lay in the warmth of the valley, in a home he hadn't built with money, but which was built for him by the love of a resilient woman and the laughter of an extraordinary girl. Every step on this new path was a confirmation that he was, for the first time, heading in the right direction. Life, which for so long had resembled a journey across a stormy sea, had found a bay of calm waters. John's proposal for Mary to walk by his side was not a decree but an invitation, and her answer was not an immediate yes, but a gradual acceptance, a slow and cautious blooming. She continued for a while with her work routine at the mansion. It was a ritual that grounded her, a rope that connected her to the woman she had become on her own, strong, self-sufficient, a survivor. To abandon that identity all at once was too big a step. John, with a seemingly infinite patience, understood the complexity behind her hesitation. He saw that it wasn't a lack of feeling, but an excess of history. He watched her from afar, from his office window, as she tended the garden with a fierce concentration. He saw in her the resilience of a desert plant, which learned to bloom with very little water and now found itself before an ocean. He knew he couldn't just push her. He had to teach her how to swim in the abundance of affection, to trust that the tide wouldn't carry her away. The mansion became the stage for this slow and beautiful acclimatization. The barriers of boss and employee dissolved completely, giving way to a domestic partnership. Conversations flowed with a naturalness that would have been unthinkable before. They discovered each other's rhythms, his need for silence in the morning, her habit of humming softly while she cooked. Sophie, the small, wise ambassador of this new world, acted as the definitive bridge. One afternoon, with irrefutable childlike logic, she asked, "Dad, if Mommy lives here now, why does she still have to clean the floor?" John, looking directly at Mary, answered with a softness that was all for her. "Because Mommy is the strongest person I know, and she's teaching us that a real home is built with time, care, and a lot of love." Mary, hearing that, felt another one of her internal walls crumble. The weekends became the laboratory where they experimented with being a family. Every outing was a small brick in the construction of their shared history. They were moments of such profound normality that, to Mary, they seemed extraordinary. Stopping for ice cream, choosing a movie to watch at night, arguing over the best route to the supermarket, each of these mundane acts was an affirmation of their new life, a balm for the wounds of a lonely past. It was on one of those weekends, on an autumn Saturday so perfect it looked like a painting, that Mary's latent fear finally surfaced. The suggestion of a picnic in the park was met by Sophie with an explosion of joy that made the very air vibrate. As they prepared the basket in the kitchen, a scene of happy domesticity unfolded. John, who once barely knew where the plates were, was now seriously discussing with Sophie the ideal ratio of jam to peanut butter in a sandwich. Mary watched them, and a wave of happiness so pure and intense ran through her that it momentarily left her breathless, and right after came the chill down her spine. Happiness, for her, had always been the harbinger of loss. The park was dressed in its finest autumn colors. A golden, melancholic light filtered through the treetops, turning the carpet of dry leaves into a mosaic of gold and bronze. The air was crisp and carried the smell of damp earth and the sweet scent of burning wood somewhere in the distance. There was a peace in the air, a sense of suspended time that only served to intensify the turmoil of emotions inside Mary. They found a spot under an ancient oak tree, whose gnarled branches seemed to tell stories of many seasons. What followed was a succession of moments so perfect they seemed scripted. John, stripped of any trace of the businessman, belonged completely to Sophie. He became a wild horse, a tickle monster, a fellow explorer in search of the world's shiniest rock. The sound of Sophie's laughter, free and crystalline, was the afternoon's soundtrack. The culminating moment was when John lifted her onto his shoulders, walking through the grass while she, with her arms outstretched, narrated the world from her elevated perspective. "I can see the tops of the trees. I see a bird's nest. I'm the queen of the park." Mary, from the checkered blanket, was the silent chronicler of that scene. Her eyes recorded every detail, the way Sophie's hair shone in the sun, the genuine and unreserved smile on John's face, the ease with which their bodies moved together, as if they were made for that fit. The image of the two of them, a silhouette of pure happiness against the evening light, was the materialization of a dream she had buried so deep she had forgotten she ever had it, and the resurrection of that dream terrified her, because now it was real, and everything that is real can be lost. When Sophie found a group of children and joined them in a noisy game, John returned, his face flushed, and sat down next to Mary with a sigh of contentment. He looked at her, the love in his eyes as visible as the trees around them, but his smile faltered when he saw her distant, haunted expression. "You're 1,000 miles away," he said, his voice low, concern creasing his forehead. "Where did you go?" Mary took a moment to answer, her gaze fixed on her daughter. "I was here, seeing everything, seeing you two. It's so right, so complete. It's like looking at a photograph of the life I never thought I'd have. And isn't that a good thing?" he asked, confused by the melancholy in her voice. "It's too good, too perfect," she confessed, finally turning to him, her clear eyes a window to the storm in her soul. "And that's what's destroying me. Because my life has taught me, in the hardest way possible, that perfect moments are just a pause before the pain. They're the bait, and I'm terrified of taking the bait again." The words, once released, began to flow in a torrent of repressed pain. Sophie's father wasn't just a man who left me. He was an architect of my emotional ruin. He found me when I was young and already broken, and he promised he would be the glue. He sold me a future, John, a future with a small house, a garden, laughing children. He described it in such detail that I could smell the grass and hear the laughter. And I, who had never had anything, believed every word. I built my entire life on the foundation of his promises. And when I told him I was pregnant, that our future was beginning, he looked at me not with joy but with panic. And the next day, he was gone. The foundation of my entire life turned to quicksand. The pain of abandonment was terrible, but the shame of having been so naive and of having bet everything on empty words, that's what almost killed me. It was then that I decided, never again depend, never again trust, never again place my happiness in someone else's hands. The tears she had been holding back so forcefully now flowed freely. And now, you show up, and you don't make empty promises. You build, you act, you show me every single day, with every gesture, that you are real. You love my daughter in a way that defies all my cynical logic, and you make me want to hope. And hope, and for me, is the most dangerous feeling of all. I'm afraid to get involved, to believe that this love is different, and to be abandoned again. I'm afraid that one day you'll wake up and realize that the reality of a family life, with its messes and its demands, isn't as glamorous as you imagined. And the thought of having to explain to Sophie why the second father in her life also disappeared, the thought of seeing the light in her eyes go out. I would rather die than go through that, she finished in a guttural whisper, emptied of all her strength, her heart exposed and pulsating with pain in front of him. John listened to her with a reverent stillness. He didn't interrupt her, didn't rush her. He let her empty out all her pain, all her poison. His face, when once relaxed and happy, became a mask of deep empathy and determination. When she finished, he moved closer, and the first thing he did was take both of her hands, not just one. He held them firmly, a gesture that said, "I am here. I will not let you go." "Mary," his voice was calm but carried a weight, a gravity that forced her to meet his gaze. Thank you for giving me the privilege of seeing your pain. I know what it cost you to show me these scars." He paused, his grey eyes searching hers. "The man who caused you this pain was a coward. He ran away from the greatest gift life could have given him. I am not him. I'm not here to fix you because you are not broken. You are the most whole and resilient person I have ever met. I am here because, by your side, I become whole. You're afraid that I'll get tired of the reality of your life. But, Mary, your reality is the only real thing I have ever touched. My world before you was made of shadows and echoes. You are the substance. You are the truth." He brought her hands to his chest, pressing them against his heart, which beat strong and steady. "You're worried about my world, about appearances. Let them look. Let them whisper. Do you know what they'll see? They'll see a man who finally understands what wealth is, and it's not in a bank account. It's in the hand he holds. They will say I have a beautiful, strong, and incredible woman by my side. They will see a woman who, instead of becoming bitter, transformed her wounds into wisdom and her suffering into an infinite capacity to love. You don't have to be afraid, my love. I'm not on your side for a little while. I am on your side forever. And every day of my life will be proof that this promise is not made of words, but of actions, of presence, of unwavering love." The conviction in his voice was a force of nature, a wave that washed away years of fear and doubt. Mary felt something break inside her, not from pain but from release. The belief she had so feared began to take shape, not as a fragile hope, but as a solid certainty. "I love you, John," she said, her voice clear and firm for the first time. The smile that broke across her face was like the sun breaking through the clouds. At that very instant, as if the universe had been waiting for its cue, Sophie came running towards them, her face lit up by the pure joy of being alive. She stopped abruptly when she sensed the intensity of the moment. She saw their intertwined hands, their faces marked by tears but transformed by joy. With a wisdom that needs no words, she understood. A smile of pure complicity spread across her face. She ran and threw herself into the space between them, her arms wrapping around them both in a hug that sealed the pact. She pulled back just enough to look into John's eyes, her own eyes shining with triumphant happiness. "Now you don't have to pretend to be my dad anymore. You are my real dad." The declaration, so simple and so monumental, was the final absolution. John pulled her to him, hugging her with an emotion so overwhelming that it made him bend over, his face buried in her hair to hide the sob that escaped his chest. They were the tears of a man who had spent his entire life waiting for a father, and who, in that moment, became one, healing the wounds of 2 generations at once. He felt Mary's arms wrap around them both, and in that cocoon of warmth and love, he knew. With a certainty that resonated in his soul, he knew his search was over. He was no longer adrift. He had found his harbor. His purpose, his home. Time, which was once measured by urgency, the bills for Mary to pay, the market deadlines for John, began to flow with the serenity of a wide, deep river. The years that followed that transformative day in the park were not a succession of spectacular events, but a precious collection of ordinary moments, which, together, composed the extraordinary tapestry of a happy and consolidated family life. The mansion, once a mausoleum of silent opulence, became the vibrant epicenter of their lives. The first major change was the sonorous invasion of joy. The echo of John's expensive shoes on the marble was replaced by the chaotic and cheerful sound of Thunder's paws, a mutt that Sophie had insisted on adopting, and whose fur now stubbornly adorned the designer sofas. The dining room, once a ghost space used to impress guests who never came, was transformed into the pulsing heart of the house. There, they not only shared meals, but life. It was the place where Sophie spread out her materials for school projects, where Mary sketched her flower beds on parchment paper, and where John often preferred to work on his laptop, just to be immersed in the warmth of the family chaos. The first Christmas they spent together sealed the transformation of the house into a home. John Issa, who for decades had fled the melancholy of the holidays with trips to remote destinations, found himself in the attic, opening chests that hadn't been touched since his mother's death. Inside, he found a treasure trove of old decorations, each one laden with the weight of a lonely childhood. That year, he and Sophie spent an entire afternoon untangling lights and hanging fragile ornaments on the tree, while Mary, from the kitchen, filled the house with the scent of pine and gingerbread cookies. On Christmas morning, seeing the joy on Sophie's face at the pile of presents and the serene look in Mary's eyes beside him, John felt a fullness that no business acquisition had ever provided. This was the true return on investment. Mary, in turn, blossomed in a way she herself had not imagined possible. Quitting her job was the most terrifying and liberating act of faith in her life. The security of a salary, however modest, was the only armor she had ever known. John, understanding that her true independence was not something to be taken away, but rather strengthened, established an investment fund in her name that would guarantee her financial autonomy forever. "I don't want you to depend on me, Mary," he had told her. "I want you to choose to be with me every day." Freed from the burden of survival, Mary rediscovered the woman who existed beneath the warrior's armor. She went back to school, not out of necessity, but out of passion. Sitting in a classroom, she discovered a curious mind and an appetite for knowledge that thrilled her. She found in art history a language for the emotions she had always felt but never knew how to name. Her garden became her canvas, a place where, with her hands in the dirt, she cultivated not only flowers but her own peace of mind. Every rose that bloomed, every vegetable she harvested, was a symbol of her own ability to grow and flourish in new soil. John's transformation was perhaps the most visible to the outside world. The man who had been synonymous with an almost monastic dedication to work radically redefined his priorities. He promoted one of his most trusted vice presidents, delegating the day-to-day command of the company, and took a board position that allowed him to have a strategic vision without being consumed by the routine. His new life philosophy became legendary in his circle. "I spent half my life building an empire," he said in an interview that shocked the business world. "I intend to spend the other half enjoying my true kingdom, which consists of a woman, a girl, and a dog." He became a present father in every sense of the word. He learned to do braids with the help of online tutorials, became an expert at consoling hearts broken by small school fights, and never missed a single school play or swim meet. He discovered that the toughest negotiation he had ever faced was not with a rival conglomerate, but with an 8-year-old girl trying to convince him that 5 more minutes of video games before bed was a fair and balanced deal. And in these small domestic battles, he found a joy and a purpose that made his old corporate victories seem pale and insignificant. Sophie, the beating heart of that family, grew under the combined light of their love. The security of having an unshakable foundation made her a remarkably happy, curious, and empathetic child. The shadow of being different that had haunted her in her early childhood completely dissipated. She was just Sophie, a beloved girl, with a mother who taught her about strength and a father who taught her about kindness. She navigated the world with the confidence of someone who knows that no matter how far she goes, there will always be a safe harbor to return to. The years passed, not as a count of days, but as a collection of memories. The first bicycle without training wheels, with John running behind, his hand outstretched, and Mary on the porch, her heart in her throat. Summer vacations at the beach, building elaborate sandcastles that were always destroyed by the tide, a lesson on the beauty of the ephemeral. Winter nights, the 3 of them huddled on the sofa under a single blanket, reading aloud, each taking a chapter, their voices intertwining to create a single story. And then, on a spring afternoon that felt like a gift, almost 4 years after that picnic that changed everything, they found themselves back in the same park. The place was the same, but the landscape of their souls had been completely redrawn. The oak tree, a silent witness to their crisis and resolution, now welcomed them with a canopy full of tender and vibrant green leaves. Sophie, now almost 9, was no longer the little girl who needed to be carried. She was an energetic preteen, running ahead with thunder, her blonde hair bouncing freely. John and Mary walked further behind, at a leisurely pace, Their hands joined in a gesture that had become second nature. It was a contact that needed no words, a silent current of love and complicity that flowed between them. Mary looked at him, at the man walking beside her. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, replaced by laugh lines. There was a calmness about him, a peace that wasn't there before. He was no longer a man in search of something. He was a man who had found it. He, in turn, looked at her. The strength was still there in her posture, in her clear gaze, but the defensiveness was gone. In its place was an openness, a serenity of someone who no longer needs to fight the world, for she has found her safe place in it. "It's incredible to be here again," said Mary, her voice as soft as the afternoon breeze. "That day, I felt so much fear in this very spot. I was convinced that happiness was a trap, that the ground was going to fall out from under my feet. And I was terrified that you would leave, that my past and my world would be too much for you to bear," John confessed, squeezing her hand. "I felt that, for the first time in my life, I had something I couldn't bear to lose. And yet here we are," she said, with a smile that lit up her whole face. "The ground didn't collapse." "No," he agreed, stopping and turning to her, the love on his face as clear and present as the sun in the sky. "We built new ground, together. A foundation." Sophie, sensing the change of pace, came running back to them, her face flushed, her eyes shining. "What are you guys talking about? Are you being romantic again?" she asked, with a hint of affectionate teasing. "We're being grateful," Mary replied, extending her free hand to her daughter. Sophie took her hand, and for a moment they stood there, the three of them, a complete circle of clasped hands under the shade of the oak tree. "Dad, can we go on the swings later?" Sophie asked. "I want to see if you can still push me high enough to touch the sky." "I will always try to push you as high as I can, my love," John said, his voice thick with a sudden emotion. As they walked towards the playground, Sophie swinging between them, Mary was overcome by a wave of clarity. Their journey had not been a fairy tale. It had been real, with real pain, real fear, and finally, a real hard-won love. A love born not of perfection, but of imperfection, of the courage of two broken people who dared to show themselves to each other and discover that together they were whole. She looked at the man beside her, her partner, her best friend. She looked at the daughter before her, her heart, her greatest work, and she felt a gratitude so deep, so overwhelming, that it overflowed in silent tears. John saw her and, without a word, just squeezed her hand tighter. He knew. He felt the same. It wasn't a static, unchanging, happily ever after. It was a living, breathing happiness, one that required care, attention, and the daily choice to love. It was real, and it was theirs. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with strokes of fire and gold, they walked not towards an end, but in the midst of their beautiful, ongoing story. Three lonely hearts that, through the most unlikely of circumstances, had found in each other the way back home, and in that home, built on the foundation of courage and love, they were, finally and forever, complete. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like, because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.